Welcome to version 37 of the competitive Brawl Stars tier list. These are the best brawlers in 2024, and it's all made possible thanks to the pro players that are some of the best players in the world. And we're gonna rank every brawler from worst to best. And kicking us off at the bottom is Doug. Doug didn't get any balance changes this update. He's still the worst brawler in the game. And in fact, some of the other worst brawlers in the game's got a buff. So yeah, he struggles now. Staying in the F tier is Frank. Unfortunately, Frank wasn't one of those brawlers, so he's still just too conditional to be played often, at least competitively. Next is Hank, moving from the D tier down to the F tier. And Hank is the first of many tanks that have just been completely power crept by all these new hypercharges. BB's also moving from the D tier down into the F tier. With BB at the top of the F tier, that makes all four brawlers in the F tier close range tanks. So you can see kind of where the direction of the meta is going, and hypercharges may or may not be to blame. We've got more to cover, but I want to give a huge thank you to Samsung for sponsoring this video and for being a long-time channel partner. We are nearing the end of 2023, which means it's the perfect time to pick up Samsung's Galaxy Z Fold 5. You're definitely going to want to check out the link in the description below. I have loved having mine. You should check it out. In fact, let me show you my favorite thing to do with this phone, okay? It's so cool. Okay, so I play a lot of old school RuneScape, and old school RuneScape's a kind of game where you don't actively need to play a whole lot. Like my character's just doing this for me and I don't need to do anything. So what I can do here is while my character is actually doing stuff for me, I can literally just pull up Brawl Stars off to the side, make that really small here, and I can play Brawl Stars and then just go to a regular match here. And then when I'm ready to like do something on RuneScape, I just like make Brawl Stars small and then I can like come over here and, you know, do stuff. I'm literally playing two games at once here, which is kind of funny. I can also browse social media, text my wife over off to the side. You know, I can move this window around however I want to, or you can even pull up YouTube and like watch a YouTube video while you're doing other stuff. It's awesome. It literally is the ultimate multitasking phone. So click that link in the description below to check out the Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 5 or check out their other awesome devices, including the Tab S9 Plus or the Galaxy Watch 6. Once again, a huge thank you to Samsung for sponsoring this video. Next is the D tier brawlers. Also just terrible, but like not as bad as F. My boy Surge is going from the B tier down into the D tier. Now Surge's level 4 upgrade used to be worth the payoff of charging his supers, but now with hypercharges in the game, even at level 4, he's not that strong. Buzz is moving from the C tier down to the D tier. Buzz is always a little bit more useful than most tanks since he at least has a super that can get him close to enemies, but he's not strong enough to deal with these hypercharged brawlers. Daryl's moved from the C tier down to the D tier. Even Daryl doesn't have the stats to keep up with these hypercharged brawlers, so he's been power crept on as well. Penny is staying in the D tier. Nothing really changed with her, but some of her counters aren't being used as much, and there was a pro or two that suggested she might be underrated, so I guess time will tell, but for now she's in the D tier. El Primo's moving from the B tier down to the D tier. El Primo is another tanky brawler that just didn't get any balance changes and just isn't strong in the meta right now. Next we have the C tier brawlers. These brawlers also are not competitive, but they're like not completely terrible. Sam is staying in the C tier. Honestly, Sam could have been either D tier or C tier, but I think that his first star power is kind of keeping him somewhat usable. Ash is staying in the C tier. Ash would have also been in the D tier if it weren't for the health buff that he received this update, and it did help him a little bit. Not enough to bump him up, of course, though. Chester is staying in the C tier. Now, Chester got a buff to his health, but it doesn't seem to have changed his effectiveness, so he's right about where he was last update. Griff is moving from the B tier down into the C tier. I hate seeing this because Griff is one of my favorite brawlers to play. He's still a decent brawler, but most of the brawlers that he's really good against just aren't being played a lot, so there's not a whole lot of use for him right now. Carl's moving from the B tier down to the C tier. This is another one of my favorite brawlers getting knocked down. More and more brawlers with stuns and knockbacks are being added to the game, so Carl's just steadily moving down the tier list, unfortunately. Next is Pearl, moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Now, Pearl had her movement speed buffed, but she still probably has the worst hypercharge in the game, and charging her heat bar takes a really long time for how quickly it gets depleted. Gus is staying in the C tier. Gus received a damage buff, which has made him a little bit better than before, but it definitely did not make up for his gadget nerf from the previous update. Poco's moving from the B tier down into the C tier. Now, most of the brawlers that pair really well with Poco just aren't being used right now, so even though Poco is a decent brawler by himself, there are a lot of better options. Next, we have the B tier brawlers. These are brawlers that can be competitive in the right situation, the right map, mode, combo, or to counter specific brawlers, but they're not like good all the time. Starting us off, we have Mortis staying in the B tier. Now, even though Mortis did receive his mythic gear this update, it doesn't seem to have made any major difference for him, if at all any difference, so he's still just average. Meg Meg is staying in the B tier. And Meg didn't get any better this update. She didn't get any worse. She still has decent range and a lot of health, so she can be tough to counter even though she's not super strong. Mandy is staying in the B tier. No changes were made to Mandy, but she's being used just a little bit less often than before. Now Janet's moving from the D tier up into the B tier. She received a damage buff and a buff to her supercharge rate, and it made a very big difference for her. Now, even though she's not the strongest brawler, she's at least average for now. Bonnie is staying in the B tier. Now, Bonnie is slightly worse this update because using her super on top of a hypercharged brawler doesn't usually go very well for her, and hypercharged brawlers are becoming more and more frequent now, so she's struggling a little bit, but she's still competitive. Max is staying in the B tier. She didn't get any balance changes. She's still a decent brawler, but there are just a lot stronger options right now. Bull is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and Bull is one of the few brawlers in the game that does have a hypercharge, but it is one of the weakest, and as more brawlers get hypercharges, the more he's moving back down to just kind of being average. B is moved from the A tier down into the B tier. B is another one of my favorite brawlers. They're all going down. B has always been a very safe option, but having a really long range isn't as important as it has been in the past, at least for right now. Brock is staying in the B tier, and he's another long range brawler that's having a harder time dealing with the overall just aggressiveness of the brawlers right now. He still does plenty of damage from a far distance away, so he's at least usable though. 8-Bit's moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and while the brawlers getting hypercharges are speeding up, 8-Bit remains slower than average, so he's particularly struggling with this meta, even though he has crazy damage output. Mr. P is staying in the B tier, and he's still a solid counter to brawlers that can't pierce through targets, but other than that, he's pretty weak. Byron is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Now, Byron usually moves up or down on the tier list depending on where the tanks move that he supports, since he supports them so well, and since they're kind of moving down right now, he's also moving down. He's not quite as good. Nita is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and Nita plays really well against tanks, so she's not being used quite as much either. Ems is staying in the B tier, and she's another great tank counter, and while she does have some decent range, she can't deal very much damage to brawlers right next to her, so hypercharges have made her slightly worse, but not enough to bump her down from the B tier. Rico is staying in the B tier, and he didn't get any balance changes. He's still really good on certain maps and not good everywhere else, so yeah, B tier makes sense for him. Grom is staying in the B tier, and he's the first of most throwers who dropped down in the meta because the speed increase from hypercharges makes it very hard for throwers to land their shots. So some brawlers that normally don't counter throwers do now. Eve is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and she is still really good on certain maps where floating over water is a big advantage, but other than that, there are a lot of brawlers that are just better than her right now. Lola is staying in the B tier. Now, nothing about Lola's changed, and she's actually held her same spot for a long time, honestly, compared to a lot of brawlers that didn't get any balance changes. Otis is staying in the B tier, and he's just very slightly better than he was in the last update, just because his super is really valuable if you can land it on a brawler that has just activated their hypercharge, because it kind of like removes that ability from the game for a few seconds, right? Tick is staying in the B tier, and Tick is our second thrower that just isn't quite doing as well in this meta, but his gadget and his super are doing a pretty good job at keeping enemies away from him, so he's still usable. Sprout is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and Sprout is still a very good brawler on certain maps where its super can shut down entire pathways, but more and more brawlers like Miko are entering the game, and they counter Sprout pretty hard. Terra is staying in the B tier, and Terra plays better against close range brawlers, so while she is still usable, there are plenty of other better options right now. Ruffs is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Now, Ruffs is still a very usable brawler just because his super is really good at powering up brawlers who are already top tier. He's just not able to fend for himself as well as he used to because other brawlers are getting a lot stronger. Willow is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and she's still one of the better throwers to use even in this meta because her super can completely shut down a hypercharge and then even use that hypercharge against their teammates. Squeak is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and Squeak has had several nerfs over the past few updates, mostly to his residue gadget. Despite the nerfs, it's still one of the best gadgets in the game, and Squeak is still good at controlling big areas. It's just, Squeak's just not quite as versatile as he used to be. Gale is staying in the B tier, and Gale honestly might deserve to be a little bit higher on this list, but he's just pretty weak compared to other brawlers. He's just one of the best brawlers at countering hypercharges because he can just blow them away, so sometimes he's actually a pretty good choice. And if he had a little bit more damage, he would probably be A tier or even S tier. Colt is staying in the B tier, tier. And Colt got a buff to his reload speed, and it has made him slightly better, but for the most part, he plays pretty much the same way as before and does require a lot of skill to hit his shots. He's one of the best brawlers. Like, if you are really good against somebody who's not really good at dodging. Now, Jessie is staying in the B tier. Jessie's hypercharge isn't quite as strong as most of the others, but you can get a lot of value out of it in certain situations, especially in Heist, which makes her fit pretty well in the B tier. Chuck is moving from the A tier down into the B tier, and he's starting to get countered more and more easily. But if there isn't a counter for him in the match, he's pretty much unstoppable in Heist. But we're seeing a lot of the pro players doing a really good job at countering him, even in Heist. And the World Championship, like, that happened quite a bit, actually. Gene is moving from the A tier down into the B tier. Now, Gene didn't get any balance changes, but he's another brawler that just got power crept on really hard, and there are just much better choices right now. I'm sure he and many other brawlers I've already mentioned will be back in the high tiers once they get their hypercharges, but right now, the meta is kind of dependent on the stronger hypercharges that are released. Barley's moving from the A tier down into the B tier, near the top of it, and Barley's still a great brawler for controlling large areas, and he is a great brawler if the enemy doesn't have a counter to him. That being said, more of his counters are coming into the game, so he does struggle more than some other times. Buster is also moved from the A tier down into the very top of the B tier. Now, Buster's still a pretty good brawler despite his short range. Now, his slow-mo replay gadget just had the slowing effect taken away, and it seems to have made a bigger difference than I expected, though they might have to find a different name for the gadget now. But now we have the A tier brawlers. These brawlers are very competitive options in a lot of game modes, a lot of situations, but they're not quite as good as the S tier brawlers, which are the kings and queens of the meta right now. First, we have Pam moving from the S tier down into the A tier. And Pam was very strong for a short while when she got a buff to her star power, and while she's still pretty good, she's certainly not the best anymore. Amber is actually moving from the B tier up into the A tier. She received a buff to her damage, and it has made a very big difference for her. She doesn't even have a hypercharge, and she still has the damage output to compete with the other top brawlers. And I should also mention that she did get a secret buff to her Dancing Flames gadget, so it deals 2,200 damage per tick, and she's actually pretty good at the moment. Stu is staying in the A tier. Now, Stu still isn't quite being one of the top brawlers in the game, but it takes some crazy balance changes to put him below the A tier just because he's such a solid brawler in the hands of a really skilled player. Sandy is staying in the A tier, and Sandy's actually really good against aggressive brawlers, not only because of his strong main attack that's easy to land, but also because of his stun gadget. He also adds a lot of support to brawlers that are really good in the meta because of his super, making them invisible. Belle is staying in the A tier, and she's just slightly worse than she was before, but her super is honestly great against any brawler, and she has enough range where she can actually safely be picked for most maps and modes. RT is staying in the A tier, and RT pairs very well with a lot of brawlers that have attacks that are really easy to land, even if it's just a little bit of chip damage. Then you have his hacks gadget, which honestly makes him really good at handling his own in 1v1 situations as well. Jackie is staying in the A tier, and Jackie's hypercharge has made her a top tier brawler ever since she's had it. She's still not like one of the best brawlers anymore, but for being a close range tank in this meta, she's actually very good. Dynamite is moving from the B tier up into the A tier, and his new hypercharge has made him significantly better than before. His attack is no easier to land than before, but just the added damage to his super while he has his hypercharge has made him a great brawler in him by himself. And plus, you know what? Dyna Jump, now you can do double jumps and stuff with it. I don't know how heavily that weighs into the pro's decision of bumping up into the A tier, but you know, it's interesting. Crow is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Now, Crow's hypercharge has brought him back into the A tier, but it's still not strong enough to make him one of the best brawlers in the game. The damage output in certain situations can be incredibly overpowering, but those situations happen very infrequently, so he's in the A tier, very strong. Shelly is moving from the S tier and has been there for a long time down into the A tier. Now, Shelly's hypercharge was the main thing keeping her in the S tier, and now that there are more brawlers with hypercharges, she's being used a little bit less, but she's still really good. Gray is staying in the A tier, and Gray is already a good brawler by himself, but his super pairs incredibly well with some of the strongest brawlers' supers as well. He makes a lot of the close range, like unusable brawlers, at least playable and good in situations. Like Gray paired up with a Jackie is actually terrifying. Piper is staying in the A tier, and Piper is still one of the best long-range brawlers in the game, and I don't see her going anywhere lower than A tier unless she herself gets nerfed. But when she gets a hypercharge, man, Leon is moving from the B tier up into the A tier. Very similar to Crow, Leon's new hypercharge has moved him up an entire tier, and even though it didn't make him overpowered, just the stat boost alone has made him much better. I would say that he has one of the weaker hypercharges in the game, but it's still pretty good. And really, it's that extra speed and damage that really makes a big difference for him. Rosa is moving from the S tier down into the A tier. She's just another very powerful brawler despite having a short range. She used to be one of the best brawlers, but she's getting power crept a little bit by other hypercharged brawlers, so she's going down a little bit, but still very strong. Next is Charlie, moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Charlie received 4 nerfs this update, and she's still a really good brawler. Not only because of her hypercharge, but because her super instantly gets rid of any enemy, which is always a major advantage, even if it's just for a few seconds. Now next we have Larry and Laurie, or the twins. Now Larry and Laurie are the first brand new brawlers on this list, and they have not been released yet, so it's still really hard to tell how good they will be. In fact, I have absolutely zero say in where any of the brawlers get placed. All of it is done by the pros, with the exception of new unreleased brawlers, because I've played these new brawlers more than the pros have. So this placement does come with an incredibly large grain of salt, just keep that in mind. The thing is though, is that Laurie is just a bot, which is pretty easy to deal with, but just the sheer amount of damage that the two of them together can deal absolutely makes them worthy of A tier. Next, we have Nani, moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Nani received a nerf to her health, which has obviously made her more fragile, but her offense wasn't affected at all, and that's the best part about her. So like, while she's not quite as good as she was, she's still very solid. Next, we have Edgar, moving from nearly the bottom of the tier list up to almost the S tier in the A tier. Edgar's hypercharge was so powerful upon release that he honestly might have been the best brawler in the game for a few days. Then they had to give him an emergency nerf, which I was not expecting, right? Who could have expected Edgar needing an emergency nerf, right? But for the first time since Edgar was released, he is a really good brawler and belongs in the A tier. Next, we have Spike, moving from the S tier down into the A tier. Spike is still very close to being an S tier brawler, but the nerf to his mythic gear just was enough to where he doesn't feel totally overpowered now. He is at the very top of the A tier though, and is, like I said, just almost S tier. But now we have the S tier brawlers. These are the best brawlers, the kings and queens of the meta. They're pretty much good in any situation, no matter the map, mode, comp, or whatever. And kicking us off, we have Miko starting in the S tier. Now Miko's another brand new brawler, but he has been released for a while now, and there's a huge debate going on between whether he's one of the worst or the best. According to most of the pros, they say that he does take a lot of time to figure out, but once you learn how to play him well, he is an S tier brawler for sure. And I'll be honest, I thought he was complete trash when I first started playing him. So like, this was a wake up call for me that Miko might be better than I thought. Now next, we have Bo, moving from the C tier all the way up into the S tier. Bo received a buff to his attack damage, and I guess it was way too much because he's being used on every map and nobody seems to be able to counter him. It was a massive attack damage buff, so he's really good at the moment. Cordelius is moving from the A tier up into the S tier. Cordelius probably has the most solid counter to hypercharges in the game, and not only that, but if he can win a 1v1 without using his super, he can then use his super on another brawler to create a 2v1 situation for his teammates, which is impossible to maintain map control if you're the one that is facing off against those two players, right? Next is Colette, staying in the S tier. Colette was one of the best brawlers before, and she didn't receive a balance change at all, and she's still ridiculously strong. We saw her being played a lot in the World Championship. Next is Lou, staying in the S tier. And unlike Colette, Lou did receive a small nerf to his supercharge rate, but it doesn't seem to have made him much of a worse brawler. He still has one of the best hypercharges in the game, maybe even the best. Next, we have Maisie, who is moving from the A tier up into the S tier. And Maisie's another hypercharged brawler that didn't receive any kind of nerf, and she's still one of the best hypercharged brawlers at dealing with other hypercharged brawlers. So she's being played a lot by the pros right now. Next is Fang, moving from the A tier up into the S tier. Like Edgar, Fang's hypercharge was completely broken on release, so they had to give him an emergency nerf. But unlike Edgar, it's still completely broken. He's incredibly strong right now. One of the best brawlers, could be the best brawler, and could have the most busted hypercharge. But the #1 brawler, we're calling it now, is going to be Kit, starting out in the S tier at the very top. Once again, take this with a huge grain of salt because this is more to do with my own opinion and less to do with the pros. But based off of what he's able to do with other certain brawlers and how strong he is just by himself, he seems like he is going to be the best brawler in the game if he does not get some sort of a nerf. The fact that he can just hang out on his teammate and then deal insane damage with every single attack is busted because it then becomes a 3v3, but those other 3 players can only aim at 2 enemies. So it makes it harder for enemies to actually hit him, and he can heal his teammate while he's hanging out on them, dealing absolutely insane damage. If he lands on an enemy with his super, it is impossible for them to actually deal damage to him until he's just finished attacking, and he's gonna be a busted legendary. That's right. And there you have it, the competitive tier list for 2024. Make sure you grab that screenshot. Just don't crop my face out if you share this with anybody else. And I want to give a huge thank you once again to the pro players that made this possible. Once again, this tier list was made by them. This had almost no feedback from myself incorporated into it. That's how you know it's good, because while I like to pretend that I'm good at the game, well, I'm nowhere near pro level. Like, those guys are insane. Subscribe for future tier lists because I will be updating this throughout 2024. We'll see you in the next video.